Okay, so the iterated prison's dilemma. We don't need to say very much about this. We saw yesterday that defection is the dominant strategy in one-player games. It's also the dominant strategy when you know how many times you're playing the game. There's a well-known argument called a backwards induction argument. If you know what it is, then that's fine. If you don't, look it up. But as I pointed out yesterday, when the number of iterations is not known, the strategy that you should play over time depends upon how likely it is that the other player is a cooperator and the likelihood of encountering that player again. Okay, so yesterday when we were talking about this, we talked about the way in which this was interpreted by Cosmides and Tooby in support of the massive modularity hypothesis. So the idea was that their idea is that this only works if we have a cheater detection module. But I want to draw a slightly different lesson from it. So here are two ways of applying tit for tat. Just tit for tat. Okay, so there are two strategies. There's the mind reading strategy. So wait a minute, so let me back up. So we need to work out the likelihood that the other player is a cooperator. This is a fact about the other player's psychology. Okay? It's a psychological trait. It depends upon their beliefs and their intentions and so on. So how do you apply it? How do you work out the utility of the strategy? Well, you need to... One way of thinking that you work this out by engaging in psychology and trying to work out whether the person is a cooperator. So you might adopt what I call the mind-reading strategy. You might assess the other player's character and expectations. You might try to influence her assessment of your character and expectations. You might make yourself out to be a nice guy when you're not, or the other way around. No, you wouldn't want to do that. Or you might adopt what we talked about yesterday, which was the heuristic strategy. You might just adopt a simple rule, tit for tat, or tit for two tats, as we said. Now, the point about this is that it's not based on predictions about how other people will behave. It's not based on assessments of their character. It's not based on psychology at all. It's an example of behavior reading, not an example of mind reading. So we know what tit for tat is. But in this book by Axelrod that I mentioned yesterday, he synthesizes a number of empirical studies that have shown, or what they've shown is how you can use tit for tat to illuminate or to model many complex human interactions, including interactions between French and German troops during the First World War, and patterns of alliances, sorry about that spelling mistake, in the United States Senate. So amongst the many ideas that he tries to get across, I thought this very simple heuristic can be used to predict and to make sense of incredibly complex, sophisticated types of social interaction. And suppose it's the case, I'm not a sociologist, thank God, so I don't have to make any speculations about what's going on in these sorts of situations. But suppose it's the case that Axelrod is right. Suppose it's the case that these sorts of things might come about through people simply applying tit for tat type heuristics without engaging in complex forms of propositional attitude mind reading. Then we certainly would have examples of how these very complex social interactions can take place without any propositional attitude mind reading. So this would weaken the case, I think. This would weaken the hold that propositional attitude mind reading might have on you as well. It might weaken. What's it going to weaken? It's going to weaken your sense that propositional attitude mind reading is indispensable for social coordination, social interaction, social understanding. Okay, so I like frame-based systems in AI as well. So these came about partly as in response to the frame problem in the late 1970s, I guess, and early 80s. And the idea was that people weren't having much success writing programs that would have sort of common knowledge databases in, and that could draw on these knowledge databases to solve problems. So the alternative idea was to write programs that used very simple templates for routine actions and just allowed those templates to be modified to fit particular circumstances. So Minsky was a big guy in this. So here's Minsky on the subject. Here's the essence of the theory. When one encounters a new situation or makes a substantial change in one's view of the present problem, one selects from memory a structure called a frame. This is a remembered framework to be adapted to fit reality by changing details as necessary. A frame is a data structure for representing a stereotyped situation, like being in a certain kind of living room, or going to a child's birthday party, or seeing a leopard and alerting the other vertebrate monkeys. Attached to each frame are several kinds of information. Some of this information is about how to use the frame. Some is about what one can expect to happen next. Some is about what to do if these expectations are not confirmed. So he continues, we can think of a frame as a network of nodes and relations. The top levels of a frame are fixed and represent things that are always true about the supposed situation. Whenever there's a child's birthday party, there's certainly a birthday. But it depends, it could be the second birthday, it could be the third, it could be the 14th, who knows. And so that's where the lower levels come in. These have many terminals, slots that must be fitted in, that must be filled in by specific instances or data. So where you set the parameters. So this is a fourth birthday party. Each terminal can specify conditions its assignments must meet. If it's the children's birthday party, then 27 is not an acceptable assignment. Simple conditions are specified by markers that might require a terminal assignment to be a person, an object of sufficient value, or a pointer to a subframe of a certain type. More complex conditions can specify relations amongst things assigned to several terminals. So the idea here is that instead of trying to there are lots of social situations that we don't try and solve from scratch. We have routines that solve them, and we just adapt the routines to fit the specific cases. So why is this interesting here? Well, one reason it's interesting is that the parameters to the frames don't have to be propositional attitude attributions. So I might have an interaction frame. I might have my restaurant frame, for example. So I go to the restaurant, I order my meal, at every stage it's clear what's happening. And I'm just setting the parameters, and I'm following the frame. If you're Jackson, who we looked at before, what's going on? I'm interpreting the person coming towards me. I'm thinking, he believes that I'm a customer. He desires to receive my order. He believes that blah, 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 blah. And the frame gives us another way of thinking about it, where you don't need to go through all the propositional attitude stuff. So they can be purely behavioral, or they can just be set by perceptual mind reading. I can just see that the waiter sees me. If I see that the waiter sees me, then I can attract his attention and ask for the bill. I don't need to think, well, if he sees me making this gesture, then he will believe that I desire to have the bill. So on. So this way of thinking about things, I think, is interesting because it gives us a way of thinking about some of this observational data, sometimes cited as evidence of propositional attitude mind reading in primates. Now you need to know a little bit of background here. So the social intelligence hypothesis, or the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, was put forward by Byrne and Whiten as a result of their study of a database of observations of primates. So they basically just compiled lots of anecdotal reports of how people had observed primates in the wild and tried to categorize them into groups, and then just drew conclusions from that. They said, well, you can't, we need to interpret these in terms of propositional attitude mind. They didn't use those terms, but that's what they did. But I think the frames-based approach provides another way of thinking about it. And what I want to stress is that the data that we've got are just observations. They're just people out, tourists there, well, they are tourists, they're academic tourists. But they're just writing down what they see. These are not controlled experiments. This is not science in any shape or form.
I can see clearly the difference between the behavioral response and the perceptual mind reading. For example, in the example that you did about the man that thinks that it's raining, so you can make the inference that he's going to take his umbrella. And that was an example of perceptual mind reading.
That was an example actually of propositional attitude mind reading.
Yes. But you said that sometimes you can make that inference without propositional representation.
No, what I said was that sometimes all you need is that if you're making an inference from propositional attitudes, you need to represent background psychology. But often, when you're just simply representing perceptual states, you don't need to do that.
Can you give an example about the perceptual mind reading in humans?
Perceptual mind reading in humans? Sure. I see that the waiter sees me. Which is different from I attribute to the waiter the belief that I am here.
But that can be behavioral. That you see that when people sees you with that face,
it's
always
true.
they take care of it.
It's true. And so there's a very interesting discussion, again involving people from Michael Tomasello's lab, about how we understand apparent perceptual mind reading in primates. Do we understand it as real perceptual mind reading, or do we understand it as sensitivity to eye gaze? To the direction in which the eyes are.
There are some experiments which show that they tend to...
You're too quick with your experiments. There are some experiments that are being very much discussed in precisely that way.
I have some comments on the rain example, but I'm going to skip it so that you gain more speed.
No, well, that's all right. But so the experiments that you're thinking of are the ones where I think these are the experiments you're thinking of. I'm not going to launch out into some massive propositional attitude mind reading here. I'm going to just use a quick and dirty heuristic, which is probably that this is what you're thinking of. So the ones where we have dominant chimpanzee alpha and a less dominant chimpanzee beta, and food is put somewhere on the subdominant chimpanzee's side of this enclosure. And what these guys, Tomasello and Call, found in a well-known paper in 2001 was that the subdominant chimpanzee would often tended to get the food when in situations where the alpha male couldn't see it. Okay? But now, the reason I say that these are hotly debated is because, so how exactly do we interpret this? Do we interpret it as the subdominant chimpanzee can see where the chimpanzee is seeing? Or do we interpret it that the subdominant chimpanzee can see that there is an obstacle, so that there is no continuous line of sight? And there's a very big difference between seeing that there is a continuous seeing that there isn't a continuous line of sight, and seeing that and seeing that somebody is seen. Are those the experiments you're thinking of?
Yes, but I
See,
remember one
my quick and dirty heuristic work.
which they covered their heads with buckets.
That's a different experiment. That's Povinelli experiment. Povinelli and Eddy, 1996. So and this was trying to show that chimps don't have any understanding even of eye gaze.
Yes.
So the idea was that it was kind of like the dog thing. So the idea is that the chimpanzees don't discriminate between you when you're looking at them and when you're looking at something when you've got a bucket over your head.
Yeah.
So that then anything to do with eye gaze makes no odds to them. Now the way in which people think about those experiments are very important for shaking people's confidence in overly quick interpretations of what's going on in chimps. But a lot of people say that they don't really reveal much about chimpanzees' understanding of other chimps. Which is, so what we've got here is an understanding of the eye gaze, possibly seeing, of their conspecifics. Whereas we wouldn't, and that the skills that they may have there may not necessarily carry across to their understanding of experimenters. So there's an interesting follow-up to this story, which is that it turns out that chimps are better on the bucket task if they have been enculturated, if they've been exposed to humans for long periods of time. So that started off some research into the differences between enculturated and non-enculturated chimps, and as yet unresolved. Okay, well I've got 1 minute left. So I'm not going to go into the third part, and anyway I've presented more or less a similar version of that argument here already. So I just want to talk about communication and tactical deception. So let's consider everyone's favourite examples of communication in primates, which are vervet, monkey, alarm calls. And we know what they are. They're relatively fixed responses. So when the vervet sees a leopard, they make one call. When they see an eagle, they make another call. And when they see what's the other one?
A snake.
It's a snake, that's it. They make a third call. Now these are all pretty fixed responses. The call itself is a fixed response, and so is the way in which other vervets respond to it. And they're triggered by different perceptual experiences. But we can view all these, I think, as terminals in a frame. That there are just these complicated routines wired into vervet monkeys, but the parameters are set differently. So this is kind of like a more sophisticated type of innate releasing mechanism. One parameter, the parameters are set one way by seeing a leopard, set another way by seeing a snake, and the third way by seeing an eagle. So you can say that in a way that's compatible with saying that the alarm calls carry information. You're not saying, for example, that the alarm-giving vervet monkey is simply communicating its distress, for example. This sort of account is compatible with the idea that there really is some signaling going on here. There's communicative behavior. But no assumption that there's any attempt to manipulate the informational states of conspecifics. So there's a routine, and we're all part of it. We, the community of vervet monkeys, or we are just for the moment. So we all know the routine. We know what happens. We know how to behave when we see a leopard. We know how to behave when we hear the leopard cry. And there's a complicated signaling information transfer within that frame, but there's no sort of psychological, there's no mind reading going on. So tactical deception, here are some more examples of line of sight type stuff. So Kuma There's a famous description of Kuma, who's well, it's an alpha male. It's a subordinate male who's grooming a female behind a rock, and the female moves in such a way, and the alpha male moves in such a way that they are able to groom away without, in a way that exploits the existence of a rock blocking the line of sight between the dominant male and the dominant male and the alpha male. So from the alpha male's perspective, all the alpha male can see is a female baboon behind a rock. What Kuma can see from his vantage point is the female baboon grooming the subordinate male, in the full knowledge that the dominant chimp can't see what's going on. So this is really kind of the in the wild version of this sort of stuff. These experiments are ways to try and turn these observations into something that looks like science. Again, we've got some terminals. So we've got the kind of the avoidance, the secret grooming frame that has terminals for perceptions of obstacles, that has terminals for alpha male's line of sight. So you can see the same frame being applied here. And those terminals fix and determine the possible movements relative to the obscured line of sight. Okay, so that's actually all I'm going to have time to do. But let me just sum up what I'm trying to achieve. The bit in red is the bit that we're not going to get to. So what I've tried to show is that there are ways of thinking about propositional attitude mind reading in humans that ways of thinking about social coordination, social understanding in humans that don't involve propositional attitude mind reading. And that we can use those same alternatives to make sense of at least some examples that people have drawn conclusions from when it comes to non-linguistic creatures. And that's a good thing, because in the hidden part of the paper, the hidden units of my paper contain an argument that propositional attitude mind reading is language dependent. So what I'm trying to do is to find an intermediate position that will do justice to all the examples that we have of sophisticated cognition, sophisticated social cognition in animals, but we interpret them in a way that is consistent with my argument, which is that propositional attitude mind reading is language dependent. And the reason it comes out as being language dependent is that propositional attitude mind reading involves representing the reasoning that would lead a creature to behave in a certain way. And those representations require representing logical relations, and logical relations stand between things that have structure, and the only things that have the right sort of structure are linguistic in form. And there are some other bells and whistles in the argument, but that's the basic line. So I'm sorry I didn't have time to finish. But I have finished. That's the end.